We're continuing on through our series of looking at and discovering the books of the Bible, looking at what are the contents of the book. Why should I, as a Christian, read this book of the Bible, knowing that the Bible, this is not only part of God's Word, but what is the inherent value of this book? What can I hope to gain in reading and studying this book that perhaps I don't study often or haven't studied as much as I have other books? And so we're looking at this book to get an idea of what is contained within the book of Numbers and what can I expect to learn from it, to spend my time here and to maybe perhaps even desire to spend time here more than somewhere else instead. We're looking at this book, and I want to go ahead and point out to us the book of Numbers is picking up where we've left off in the book of Exodus. You'll remember as we did an overview of the book of Exodus that God's people, the children of Israel, have reached the Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, and they're still there at this point in reading through the book of Numbers, which is surprising to us, I think, or it can be when we remember what's going on in the narrative. The book of Leviticus separates the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers. And as we looked in the book of Leviticus, God was providing His people the means and ways that they could be made right with Him. They've sinned because of the golden calf in Exodus chapter 32. God has given them the directions already of how to set up the tabernacle. But they're left at the end of Exodus not being able to approach God in His home, in the tabernacle. And so the book of Leviticus is primarily about the laws, the regulations, the offerings that He gave to them that can help make them right before Him, depending on various types of sins and scenarios that way. So we come to the book of Numbers, and at this point we're going to look and see where the narrative picks up, them leaving Mount Sinai, and where do we go next. And so as we look at an overview of the book of Numbers, I submit to you that there are generally three main parts to the book of Numbers, and the first of which takes up chapters 1 through 10 of the book of Numbers. We're going to be reading about the first census and the preparation for departure. Even here in the book of Numbers, the first 10 chapters, they haven't left yet. But they're getting ready to leave. They're making the final preparations. God is giving them the last things that they need to be ready to make their journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. And so as we look at and break down some of these chapters, we're going to be simplifying the big highlights of each chapter. We don't really have time to go over all the details of this book because there are so many important details in the book of Numbers. There are many chapters that serve as an important detail for something. And so we're not able necessarily to dive in as deeply as I would like for us to. But I do want us to see the overall big picture. I want us to see what the book of Numbers has to contribute to us as we study it and learn from it what we need to help us in our walk with God. And so as we break down chapters 1 through 10, here's what we see here. Again, God is giving them information. He's giving them what they need to prepare and to depart to the Promised Land. Chapter 1 begins with God having the people number themselves, and several things about that numbering. He has every single tribe number all of their people. He has them take note of how many males, how many men do they have of age 20 or older, for the purpose of knowing how many warriors do they have if they were to go off into battle. How many fighters do they have? And starting at the age of 20 and older. Then we look at chapter 2, we see God organizing the tribes. God places His tabernacle in the center of all of His nation. But then He tells them where to place each nation with the tabernacle in the center. Even with God knowing the exact number of His people and helping them to know exactly how strong they are with how many warriors there are, God still chooses to place Himself in the center of themselves. God is the center of their lives, just as God would teach us throughout the Bible that He is to be the center of our lives as well. God is reinforcing that with His people, and they are ready, if anyone was ever to attack them because of God's organization, to defend themselves with the organization God gives. Chapters 3 and 4 lay out for us more of the Levites' duties. The Levites were the tribe that God chose, that God picked to serve as priests. They were going to be the ones to serve the people and the offerings that God had prescribed to them and helping them partake of and offer these offerings to the Lord God. But the point of these two chapters here, specifically looking at the Levites' duties, is that God picked them. We will see as we continue on through the book of Numbers, rebellion, unfortunately, is a key theme of this book. And so when we come to details like chapters 3 and 4, where these are the people God specifically picked to perform this role, and if we have rebellion as a theme of the book, you can imagine what might happen as we read through the narrative. People are going to try to usurp this authority. They're going to want to put themselves in the place of the priests. But these are the people that God picked. And we'll see how God interacts and deals with those who try to place themselves where He has not placed them. God continues to give them laws about cleansing and holiness. Specifically, this is where we see the Nazirite vow be described to us in chapters 5 through 6. They have one last big dedication and Passover feast and festival before they head out. And chapters 9 and 10 set the picture for us of God guiding them through the wilderness. The chapter 9 specifically lays out God's pillar of cloud laying above their tabernacle. And so they knew that if the cloud stayed still, they were to stay still. If the cloud's getting up and moving, we're supposed to get up and move. Pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. God will guide them through the wilderness. And so thus God has taken a census. He knows who His people are. He has appointed people to their specific roles. They know how they're to be organized. They know how strong they are because they know their numbers. God is again still instructing them how they can be clean and holy, and God is ready to lead them through the wilderness. What could possibly go wrong with God in charge? And thus we come to our second main section of the book where we'll spend the majority of our time here. Unfortunately, in chapters 11 through 25, this takes up the majority of the book, but also the most important parts of the book, learning where Israel falls short before God. We will see the wilderness wandering and where they go wrong and their various forms of rebellion to God in these chapters of the book of Numbers. We look at chapter 11. They begin leaving Mount Sinai in the second half of chapter 10, and immediately by chapter 11, the people are complaining. We wish we were back in Egypt. Why have you let us out this far? We wish we would have just stayed in Egypt where we were nice and comfortable, where we had meat, where we had fish as much as we wanted. And they're complaining to God about what He is providing for them. He's giving them everything they need, their food, water. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy to walk around in a wilderness, a desert wilderness for a long time, but God is giving them what they need. They're in an environment where God is taking care of them, and He is demonstrating to them daily how He is taking care of them, and they're complaining about what God has provided. And so God does provide. He provides them quail as they have been longing and complaining for meat. And in the midst of them eating, it says, the anger of the Lord burns hot against His people, and He wipes out a whole bunch of them on the spot while they're eating quail with plague. The consequence for their complaints against God's provision. And not only do they complain against what God has provided, they also complain against those whom God has set up to lead them, even to individuals such as Miriam and Aaron. By the way, this is Moses' brother and sister, complaining against Moses and what he has done in leading the people out from Egypt toward the promised land. Miriam complaining against Israel, and she's starting up a rebellion, getting people to get angry at Moses. God strikes her with leprosy for it. And she has to do several things to be cleansed of her leprosy. Ultimately, we also read in these chapters of her death. And she does not leave on a good note, unfortunately. But even Moses' own sister leads in rebellion against Moses. Even Aaron, his brother, who is the high priest at this time still, leads rebellion against Moses. Aaron, who is alongside with Moses, went with him to speak to the Pharaoh in Egypt, the one whom God has demonstrated work through Himself, again falls short in complaining against Moses. Not particularly in chapter 12, but we will see Aaron also receive his punishments for his rebellion as well, not being thankful and trusting in God's provision of Moses as their leader. But the center, if you will, the key, I think, turning point in the book where things really go down wrong is in chapters 13 and 14, where you know the story. The 12 spies go in. They spy out the land. They're in there for 40 days, 40 nights, spying out the land. 10 come back saying, we can't do it. We can't make it work. We can't overcome. We can't take over the land. Not trusting in God. But Joshua and Caleb, the only two leaders of their tribes who say, we can take it. It is at this moment where God says, all of you who doubted, who did not believe that you could go in and take the land, fine. You won't get to. You won't get to go into the promised land. You are going to wander around in this wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for every singular day that the spies spent in the land, the promised land, spying it out for you. And thus you have the older generation have lost sight, they have lost privilege to the promised land, the land of which God has been leading them to. He has been providing for them. He has been guiding them to this very place. He has provided for them what they need to be in a right relationship with God. And they still don't believe, despite everything God has done for them in bringing them out of Egypt, keeping them alive, providing for them His law, giving them the offerings, and bringing them to this very point. And they lose sight of the promised land. They lose sight of the privilege to enter because of their rebellion, their lack of trust in God. And this is just chapters 11, 12, and 13, and 14, and things are already down pretty badly. It unfortunately doesn't end there. As we continue reading through this section, there are 5 more major rebellions, 5 more major consequences, 5 major events that happen in their life cycle, in their wandering of the wilderness, of people being punished for their rebellion. In chapter 16, Korah's rebellion, speaking against Moses, speaking against those whom God has ordained to lead them. And what do Korah and his followers receive for their punishment? God swallows them up by the earth because of their rebellion against Moses. In chapter 20, the people are complaining again. They're complaining about God not providing for them. They're thirsty this time. And Moses separates himself from the promised land by making himself equal with God. The people complain about water, and Moses says, "How long shall I continue having to provide and deliver you from your thirst, your hunger?" And he puts himself on the same level as God. And in chapter 20, God says, "Because you have not kept me as holy above the people, you will not get to lead the people into the promised land." Moses himself, the one who is regarded in the Jews' history as one of the greatest figures in the history because of the Exodus, because of God through him bringing the people out of Egypt, loses sight of the promised land. And this is applied to Aaron as well. It is said this of both Moses and Aaron here in chapter 20, why they lose sight of the promised land. Sad reality that even leaders are susceptible and vulnerable to complaints and putting themselves on the same level of God and receiving consequence for that. Many lessons for us to learn from these major rebellions. But despite all of Israel's failings, God still provides for His people. When you look at chapters 22 through 24, you look at Balaam and Balak. To kind of summarize what we see in these chapters, Balak is an opposing enemy king. He looks at God's people, the nation here, and he's afraid. He's afraid they're going to come in and take over, and they're going to defeat them and take over all of their land. And so he says, "Hey, Balaam, you're some sort of witch doctor. Go curse them." So Balaam goes to curse them, and he finds he can't do it. God will not allow him to curse His people. And this happens 3 separate times of Balak trying to send Balaam to go curse his people. And each time, God protects His people from cursing, not allowing Balaam to curse His people. Even though Israel has separated themselves from God and they have removed themselves from the inheritance of the promised land, God still protects them. He will not let enemy nations, those on the outside, ridicule and curse His own people. God still provides, despite their rebellion, despite their lack of faith in Him. And then in chapter 25, we have the Baal of Peor. We have the Midianites come in, and we see they come and some of God's people begin to marry with their women, and they begin to participate in idolatry. Again, leading themselves away from God, not worshiping Him as they ought to. And as you might imagine, that causes more problems as well. 5 different moments of major rebellion and consequences for God's people. And you imagine looking through this section of text, all God's trying to do is to lead them to the promised land. And they themselves are the ones that keep themselves from entering. They themselves are the ones that keep themselves from entering. It's not because God put something too hard on them. It's the complaints. It's the lack of trust. They do all the work that separates them from the promise of the promised land. And so God says your children are the ones that are going to get to go in, not you. All of you who complained, all of you who have not stayed with me and believed in me, have seen all the things that I've done and believed that you could take the land, you're not going to get to enter. It'll be for your next generation to enter. And that leads us into the 3rd section of Numbers. Preparation for the promised land. Because the older generation has not faithfully kept their faith in God, because they kept separating themselves from Him and remaining in rebellion and in sin, there has to be a second census, this time counting the number of the younger generation. The number of the younger generation of which who will get to enter into the promised land. God is again starts the whole preparation process over again to help them go into the land. Joshua is appointed to be Moses' leader, or to be the leader after Moses dies. God gives laws of inheritance. Specifically in these chapters 27 and 36, you have a scenario where you have a tribe and you have a father who has daughters and he no longer has sons. And so there's a question about what about their inheritance? You see, in their world, only the men could really receive the inheritance, and their job was to provide for the women in their lives. And you have these sets of daughters who are not able to receive the inheritance anymore. And so God makes provision that through them, they too can receive inheritance. God cares about the women and the children. Those who, in that time of human life, were dependent upon men to provide for them. God makes provision for them to be able to receive inheritance that they owe, or that they own, that they have for themselves through the tribes. God gives them more offerings and vows according to the various feasts and festivals they were participating in. The Feast of Booths, the Passover, the Day of Atonement in chapters 28 through 30 gives them more offerings to participate of. In chapters 31 through 32, they go to war with Midian. Get those people out of here who brought their women and began to corrupt their own by bringing Baal worship into their nation. And punishment is dished out to those who participated in laying down with these foreign women, and for those who participated in that. And then in chapter 35, we have the cities that are designated to the Levites. The Levites always had a special place among the tribes. God provided the allotments for the land. This nation, this tribe got this part of land, this tribe got this part of land, but He didn't give that to the Levites. Again, the Levites are the ones participating as priests for the nation, and God had them set up special places for the Levites. And in chapter 35, we also see these very same cities. These cities for the Levites also become cities of refuge, for laws for those who accidentally kill someone else. You see, according to their laws, if you killed someone, whether it was by accident or whether you killed someone else, your family was allowed to take vengeance upon you. And so you could flee to these cities of refuge and be safe until the nation themselves took judgment upon you. So we see God making preparation, again, giving organization, a census, knowing who His people are. He's setting up leadership in place that they're ready now to enter the promised land, which we will begin to see as we pick up in the book of Joshua. And so as we look at the book of Numbers, what are some living lessons? What are some reasons why we should take time to study the book of Numbers? Why should we devote time, and what do we hope to learn from reading through the book of Numbers? Several living lessons to share with us. There is a danger in disbelief and complaining against God. Our attitude profoundly impacts our journey with God. Complaining reflects a lack of trust in God's provision and His sovereignty. And disbelief leads to missed blessings and prolonged struggles. When we complain, when we don't believe in God and His character and His promises that He has provided for us, we're going to miss the mark. We're not going to be able to attain all the blessings that He has promised to us because we don't live correctly in relation to Him when we're focused on the wrong thing. The real problem, I believe, with complaining and disbelief in God is that you're focused on all the things that you don't like instead of focusing on what God has already provided. Several times in the book, God will say, "Hey, do you not remember what I've done for you in bringing you out of Egypt? Do you not remember what I've provided for you as you travel through the wilderness? Do you not remember? Have you not seen what I can do and what I am doing for you?" And instead of focusing on what God has done for them, they focus on the short-term inconveniences. Man, I wish we had meat still. Man, I wish I had water as much as I wanted. God is providing for you. And yet, it's easier to complain. It's easier to focus on the things that we don't have, that we wish we did, instead of focusing on that which God has already provided. Several verses that point out these keys to us as we scan through the book of Numbers. Numbers 14, verse 11, the Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I've done among them?" Why will they not believe in me? God asks. Do we ever perhaps see ourselves in the place of God's people? Do you ever forget what God has done for you in your life? I see people who have a lot of experience in life in this room. I don't know every experience that you've gone through. But one thing I am confident in saying is that we've all been through stuff. We've all been through stuff. We have all had opportunity to see God working in our lives if we will look for those traces of God's provision. When was the last time you thought of those moments of provision from the Lord when you're in a state of complaint, a state of dissatisfaction? I know for me, I can easily fall into a wrong attitude of forgetfulness. Forgetfulness for what God has delivered me from. There are moments when I think about where I've come from, how differently I was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago. How different of a person I was, and what God has delivered me from and provided me through. But how is that for you? For those who perhaps more experience in life than I? Do you remember those moments of God's provision? And are those things you think about often? Do you count your blessings? Do you remember what God has done for you, where He has brought you from? Another example, Numbers 14, 22, and 23. None of the men, he says, again, demonstrating to the consequences of not remembering, of being stuck in complaint and disbelief in God. But God says, none of the men who have seen my glory and the signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And none of those who despised me shall see it. If we're not going to remember the good that God has done, God takes away the blessing. God takes away the blessing for His people, for those who will not remember, who despise what God has already done. You remember a similar point we made this morning, looking at Esau's example? Esau had the birthright. It already belonged to him. The children of Israel, they already had the land. It already belonged to them. God was leading them to it so they could go take hold of it. It was already theirs. And yet they forgot. And they valued the immediate needs over the long term. You know, we could see Esau's example in God's people here as well. Complaining, trading their promised land for their comforts now, forgetting that God has something far better for them in the near future, if they would remain faithful, and they fell short of this mark. But even seeing this in the New Testament, looking backwards, we see New Testament writers looking at the event of the wilderness wanderings to again teach Christians. And so we too should look at the wilderness wanderings and learn the lessons of what not to do from Israel, as we saw their complaints, as we saw their disbelief. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, in verse 10 through 11, describing there, he says, "Nor grumble as some of them grumbled and perished by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." You know, we are to learn from the Israelites' example and what they went through in the wilderness. Because in a very real way, we are in our own type of metaphorical wilderness today. And are we going to complain like them? Or are we going to allow God to continue to lead us to the promised land of heaven? Put yourself in place of Israel. Learn the lessons that they did not. Have the beliefs that they did not in God. I think is a very real and living lesson we must learn from them. We must be careful of our attitudes so that we don't lose sight of our promised land of heaven. Another lesson we can learn from Numbers, the consequence of disobedience, even for leaders. God holds everyone accountable, including those in positions of leadership. We should be careful that just because perhaps you're a husband and you're the head of the house, that you're good, that there's nothing really you have to worry about. If you were in the position of one who is teaching a Bible class or leading and teaching lessons, yeah, I'm doing all the work, I'm good. Be careful. Even leaders can miss sight or lose sight of the blessings God has waiting for us. If we had elders, even elders should be worried and concerned that they might lose sight of the promised land if they do not obey the Lord and keep faith in Him. Disobedience in even the seemingly small acts can have significant consequences. We're living our lives in relation to God, even on the little things. It's not just the big things that count. It's the little things as well. Even the little things of being thankful for the food God has provided for us on a daily basis. You know, last time I checked, every single person in this room woke up this morning and was able to walk and was able to see. We are blessed by the Lord. Do we count our blessings? As we stated earlier, all of us have gone through things. Do we remember and count the blessings of God's provision early in our lives as He continues to lead us to the promised land? A few verses that to focus on here. Numbers 20, verse 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. For those, particularly in leadership, any sort of leadership role, whether it's an older person to a younger person, whether it's a preacher to the congregation, whether it's an elder to the congregation, whether it's a father to his household, remember, you have the responsibility to uphold God as holy before everyone else. Parents, you need to teach your children to love God, to respect God. Teach them to hold Him as holy in their lives. We remember other lessons of disobedience. You look back again in Numbers 16, Korah's rebellion. Remember, there is judgment in challenging God's authority. In this context specifically, God's appointed authority. But we must be careful about challenging God's authority. And when we look out in the world around us, do we see challenges to God's authority? In perhaps the way that the local congregation is structured, and perhaps the way that the local congregation worships, and perhaps the way that the local congregation teaches its members to live their lives in relation to God. There is rebellion all around us, and we must strive to not take part in it, to not take part in the rebellion that we can observe and see around us. We are to live in the world, not of the world, Jesus would teach us. John would also teach in his epistles. There are consequences for disobedience, even for leaders. God is faithful, even amongst our failures. Despite Israel's repeated rebellion, God remained faithful to His covenant promises. The one generation, they separated themselves. They didn't get to enter. But God is still keeping His promises to Abraham. His nation, or His people, would take hold of the land. Through Abraham's seed, Jesus would come. Many of God's promises, all of God's promises, He still keeps, unless we separate ourselves from Him. His patience and provision are constant, even when people fail. Numbers 23, verse 19. God is not a man that He should lie, or a son of man that He should change His mind. Has He said, and He will not do it? Or has He spoken, and will He not fulfill it? Remember who God is. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But He will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. We need to remember who God is. You know, I may prove to myself that I make mistakes, that I fail, and that I'm not as trustworthy as God. But there is one who has constantly proved that He is trustworthy. God Himself constantly is teaching us in the Scriptures who He is, that He is trustworthy, that He is worthy of our love, and that He is in control and that we can trust Him. It's not just that we can trust Him, we can give everything to Him. We can trust everything with Him because of who He is and who He continually demonstrates Himself to be. Looking at Numbers 9, 15 through 23, again, Numbers 9 is where we saw God's guidance through the cloud. Even when they complained, God still moved and guided them. They were about to complain, but they still had to rely on God through those years of travel, of knowing where to go. Even when we find ourselves traveling through the wilderness, we have to trust God to guide us where to go. That's going to require me to study, to lean in God's Word, to understand Him better, to know what He wants me to do. But God continues to lead. He always provides us the path to Him if we will simply but follow it and not rebel against it. We see the necessity and preparation of purification for God's promises. The wilderness served as a type of school for Israel, purifying a new generation, preparing them to inherit the land. You know, the Apostle Paul in Galatians 3 and in Romans 15:14 would remind us again that the things that are written for us in the Old Testament are written for our instruction. They're written that we are able to study them and to learn from them. And so we need to remember, learn from Israel's mistakes. Don't make the same mistakes. Don't be like them, because you probably are prone to make the same mistakes if you're not careful. But you have everything provided for you to not make the same mistakes. God has provided all things for us to live lives of godliness before Him, as Peter would tell us in 2 Peter chapter 1. God often uses seasons of testing and discipline to refine us for what He has for us. We have to remember that periods of trouble, periods of hurt, periods of lack of abundance, it's a season. And God is in control. But we have to trust Him to be delivered through those things. Looking at Numbers again, 26, again looking at the second census, what is your example teaching in the next generation? Are you teaching others? You yourself need to live your life in relation to God, but also are you teaching others? And what are you teaching them? Are you setting a good example? Parents, are we teaching our children to love God? Are we preparing them to live their lives in relation to God when they go off on their own? Are we teaching them how to teach their next generation? Numbers 33. We didn't go over this chapter, but what's cool about Numbers 33 is that they're reviewing their journey. And we see that every single stop had a purpose. You ever look back at your life and think about, God had me go through this because I learned this lesson. And then God had me go through this so I learned this lesson. And then I had to go through this to learn this lesson. And that's how I came to be who I am today. Well, just like with Israel, every stop had a purpose. Every stop has purpose. We may not always understand that purpose in the moment, but we need to trust in God's guidance. We need to trust in who He is and not lose sight of His provision, that we should complain against Him. Don't know what happened there. I do want to look at one passage with you in Deuteronomy. What's unique about this passage in Deuteronomy, if you turn over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 8, is that you have a perspective of looking backwards, looking back at their time in the wilderness. We just read about all their time in the wilderness as we go through the book of Numbers. But even in Deuteronomy, there's reflecting upon their time in the wilderness. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2 through 3. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that He might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. And He humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. These periods and seasons that we go through are times of testing. God is allowing us to be tested. Will you be the kind of person He wants you to be? Will you be the kind of person who will follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ? Will you be the kind of person who will live their lives in relation to God for a short period of time? Because those who will do it for a short period of time will get to do it for eternity as they live in relation to God. Finally, and also kind of by way of invitation this evening, we can see Jesus in the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers points to Jesus Christ as the ultimate provision, the leader, and the sacrifice for us. Numbers 21, if you would turn with me there. We'll read through this together. We read about the bronze serpent here. Numbers 21, we're going to read through verse 8 and 9. Again, you remember this story. People are not behaving according to God again. God allows them to be bitten by venomous serpents. And then for anybody who's been bitten by the snakes, Moses had to create a pole and put a bronze serpent up on it, set it up, and if they would go look at the bronze serpent, they would be saved. Numbers 21, verse 8 and 9. And the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. And everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. Now turn also with me to the Gospel of John, chapter 3. Gospel of John, chapter 3. John 3, be reading verse 14 through 15 here. Again, pointing backwards to Moses. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in Him may have eternal life. Jesus had to be raised up on the cross that we might live. God used this analogy, this event in Israel's history, to make analogy, to make parallel to Jesus on the cross. Just as they had to look to the serpent to live, we too must look to Jesus to live ourselves. And one last parallel, and the lesson is yours. Numbers 20 describes to us again Moses striking the rock and keeping himself from the promised land. But turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In 1 Corinthians 10, the Apostle Paul is giving a warning against idolatry. But again, he's going to point back to Jesus being the rock that provides living water. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I'm going to begin in verse 1, but focus on verse 4. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Even in the book of Numbers, we can see Jesus foreshadowed. And in the New Testament, they look backwards to the Old Testament. They look back to the wilderness wanderings again to teach us about Jesus. Now, those analogies, those remembrances would be particularly powerful to the Jews, those who lived through it and knew that as part of their history. But why can't we also know that history? We can. We have reason to study the book of Numbers. There are many things we can learn from it, and I couldn't even cover everything that we had to learn from the book of Numbers this evening. But the book of Numbers is rich in lessons that we can learn, that we can consider ourselves and check ourselves. Are we being like Israel? Are we living faithfully in relation to God? Are we trusting in Him, or are we in a season of complaint, of not remembering what God has already done for us? The Apostle Paul here in 1 Corinthians 10:14 again points back to the rock being Christ, providing living water. Jesus, when speaking to the woman at the well, said, I will provide you living water so that you'll never be thirsty again. In Jesus, you can have a greater blessing than what you could ever have here in this life. You need to live your life in relation to God, and that starts with you becoming a child of His. Jesus said that he that believes and is baptized will be saved. If anyone has need this evening to be saved, to become a child of God, I encourage them to come as we stand and sing our invitation song.